very excellent panel with us today. We have Rebecca from Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Deputy Director based in Australia. We have Chandra Bhushan from IFOREST based in India. We have Marianne from CAN International. And we also have Nithi, who has not yet joined, but will join us shortly from CAN Southeast Asia. The event is organized by Climate Action Network, and what we are going to look at today is what kind of change we can envisage in future. So I'll hand over to Rebecca first. Rebecca, you have the floor. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. No, thank you, Sanjay, and thanks, everyone. So as Sanjay mentioned, I work with an organization called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, which is quite a mouthful. We often go by Fossil Fuel Treaty for short. We're here in Glasgow at the 5th COP since the Paris Agreement was negotiated, and this is the first COP where we're expecting countries to ramp up their nationally determined contributions and their ambition under the Paris Agreement. And we know that current pledges still aren't enough. We're still on track for around 3 degrees of warming rather than the 1.5 that we're aiming for. But when you look at the fossil fuel production side of the equation, the challenge is actually worse. So the Production Gap Report in 2021, released just a few weeks ago, found that the world is on track to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels than we can afford to if we want to stay within the 1.5 degree temperature limit. And that country governments around the world are planning to produce oil, gas and coal at a rate that's actually inconsistent with their own climate pledges. And this is obviously really important because fossil fuels are responsible for around 75% of greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution and around 90% of carbon dioxide. I obviously don't need to tell people who are attending COP and who are joining us virtually about the challenges that climate change poses, but it's really clear that we can't tackle climate change unless we tackle the problem of fossil fuel production and what we're digging out of the ground. So this brings us to the question of the energy transition. So today I'll focus on the question of fossil fuel production, which is incredibly linked, obviously, with the demand side and question of consumption. But it's sort of a forgotten angle and a forgotten focus when it comes to tackling climate change. And so that's where the initiative that I work for comes in. We are a coalition of around 900 organizations around the world who have endorsed the need for international cooperation on the production of fossil fuels under the banner of a fossil fuel treaty. And this really came out of calls over many years from island states and other countries around the world that's been taken up by academics, scientists, civil society, faith and indigenous leaders, Nobel laureates and many others, recognizing that if we want to address climate change, we can't just look at what people are consuming because that hasn't been feeding through into what we're digging out of the ground, and we're still producing far more coal, oil and gas than we can afford to. So the treaty initiative is based on 3 main pillars, which are, I think, very relevant for our discussion today on energy transition. The first is the need to end the expansion of fossil fuels. So this year, for the first time, the International Energy Agency released a scenario that was in line with 1.5 degrees. And it recognized that the energy system, firstly, doesn't require any new fossil fuels in order to continue to provide and scale up energy access. And secondly, we can't afford any new fossil fuel production if we're to remain within 1.5 degrees. And this was backed up by the IPCC report released in August, which the Secretary General recognized as being a death knell for fossil fuels. So there's a growing consensus around the need to stop investment in new fossil fuel projects. The challenge is that for some developing countries that are discovering fossil fuels for the first time or are facing pressure to expand fossil fuels into ecologically sensitive areas like the Ecuadorian Amazon, for example, because of the economic and development opportunities that fossil fuels are perceived to generate, is about how do we help these countries find alternative development pathways that doesn't require them to extract new fossil fuels, which may end up becoming stranded assets and sort of an economic burden in the long run. So it's not as simple as just turning off the tap. It's clear we can't invest in new fossil fuel projects, but that there are some challenges that are faced by countries around the world. The second pillar is about phasing out fossil fuels. So it's not just about turning off the tap, but also pulling out the plug and thinking about how we start to phase down existing production. We know that even in existing oil and gas wells that are currently digging out of the ground oil and gas, there is more carbon than we can afford to emit if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees. And that doesn't take into account existing coal mines. So in total, we already have far too many fossil fuels under production. But obviously, again, this question of phasing out fossil fuels raises some really challenging questions around equity and around which countries should be moving first when we're talking about ending the production of fossil fuels and phasing out, given that there are many economies around the world that are really dependent on fossil fuels for revenue, for government revenue and government services, and for employment. For example, there are 400 million people around the world that live in a country that depends on oil and gas for government revenue. And there are up to around 700,000 people who are directly employed by the coal sector in India alone, and around 40% of districts in India dependent on coal revenue. So again, these aren't simple questions. It's really clear that we need to be phasing out fossil fuels, but it's not a question of simply shutting down production. It's a question of how we support countries with that transition and planning now to avoid the challenges that will come over time. So that's where the third pillar of the treaty initiative comes in, and that's really the transition piece. So the idea is that obviously, the parameters that we're working in here are that we need to stay within 1.5 degrees, and ending fossil fuels is essential to that. But to do so, we need to think about a just transition for workers and communities around the world. Scaling up access to energy, there are still hundreds of millions of people that lack access to energy. So scaling up access to renewables for 100% of the population worldwide, and also ensuring economic diversification for economies and communities that are particularly dependent on fossil fuel revenues for the provision of basic services and for development. So the idea of the Fossil Fuel Treaty is that it creates a mandate for the phase out of fossil fuels with the expectation that wealthy countries should move first. But it also aims to provide a framework for support for countries that need support to undertake the transition, and for sharing of expertise and international cooperation to facilitate the transition away from fossil fuels. So I'm really excited to hear from the rest of our panelists, because I think we'll be diving into a little bit more about what that transition actually looks like, and that's certainly an aim of our work, is to start to map that transition out. And just to say that we invite all of you who are listening today to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty, or to visit our website at fossilfueltreaty.org if you'd like to find out some more. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That certainly set the ball rolling in favor of energy transition. CAN South Asia, CAN International, we have already endorsed Fossil Fuel Treaty because we believe that the change is coming. And when we speak about change, and as Rebecca mentioned about closing a tap and opening a new tap, it won't be that simple. It will be a very complicated process. It's not like a fossil fuel will vacate a seat and renewable energy will take over. We certainly do not want that any violation of human rights or other issues happen. We certainly, the way we are envisaging energy transition is to prioritize poor. Keeping that in mind, let me share my perspective on how do I see, or what could be the possible issues that we need to be careful about in energy transition. Of course, energy transition is on doorstep. I read it recently, 18 billion has been divested from fossil fuel away in recent times. That's one indicator. On top of it, success of solar and wind, they are becoming more affordable, they are predictable, they can be replicated also now. So certainly, energy transition is on doorsteps. But when we look at energy transition and hear what kind of discussions are going on, we talk about feed-in tariff in urban areas, so that those who are producing extra renewable energy, they can feed in grid if they are not using it, and they can earn money. We talk about cost of energy to consumer. We talk about electric vehicles, where to recharge them, how fast they can be recharged, etc., etc. Certainly in India, there is a push in favor of ethanol. I'm sure CB will talk a little bit about it, about that our minister is going to make it compulsory that within 6 months, flex engines will be there. We talk about skills to workers. We talk about utilization of infrastructure, how energy companies who own so much land, even if it is for mining, and that will be closed, where they will use that kind of land. We talk about incentives to companies so that they can move away from fossil fuel and adopt renewable energy and as a future. I think if you look at this long list, they all are in favor of rich and influencers. We are certainly ignoring a very major section of society which are going to get affected. Well, what will happen to communities who live in the vicinity of coal mines, for example, and when the coal mines will be closed and it will be shifted from one place to another, or energy or economy will shift from that place to a place where solar and wind energy will be produced, the local economy will shrink. And when it will shrink, what will happen to the communities who has been native there? They don't have any land for last 2 generations at least, because their forefathers, the land was acquired by them, and they are totally dependent on the economy around coal mines. They don't have any rights also. Like in many forest area, there are forest rights. They don't have many rights also, and they don't have any voice. It's not, like a labor union representing them and speaking in favor of them. And they don't have any skills also, other than the fact that they repair vehicles, they work as a driver with a contractor who provides trucks to carry coals from one place to another. So, or they work as a laborer, uploading and offloading coal from trucks. So that kind of work they have been doing. Other than that, they don't have any skills also. So keeping that in mind, if we look at from the equity perspective, they will be pushed into poverty. SDG goal 1 will be compromised for sure. It will be more difficult to achieve SDG goal 1. They will get into a debt trap. The only rescue for them would be take more debt, and they will be in a debt trap. Our calculation, when we spoke to many communities in many places, normally the debt percentage is almost 50 to 60% per year. That's the at that rate they take debt. They cannot come out of that debt. They will be forced to migrate from those places seasonally and maybe permanently. They have to go out of their social cohesive cover or community which act as a protection for them. And of course, they'll be vulnerable and they'll be prone to exploitation also. Another way to look at it, and if that convinces us, they will get into crime. They will go for illegal mining. Even if mine is closed, they will go for illegal mining. They go for deforestation. That will again hit the climate change goals. So take any argument. In both ways, it is important that energy transition is in favor of communities, and communities are kept in the center. Certainly one principle should be that let's not leave anyone behind. We have to prioritize most vulnerable. These are vulnerable who are facing floods, who are facing drought, who are facing cyclones in the coastal area. Certainly there are social schemes as of now. These social schemes are more aligned with coal economy. I think now we need to look at social schemes who need to be independent and who should be able to build their livelihood frameworks in place. And there should be an infrastructure that can create jobs separate from coal economy, separate from mining sector. They also need to be mobilized so that they can participate in decision-making processes through social dialogues. And certainly they need to be made aware about rights they have, and that knowledge will will empower them to make sure they get what they deserve. So I'll stop here, just one perspective from community's side, what needs to be done when we look at, when we are trying to demystify energy transition. I'll give floor to Nithi. You just came. If you want some breather, Chandra Bhushan can come in. Yeah? Let's go, Chandra Bhushan. CB, all yours.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you.
I think it's I came today to attend this COP, and one of the big news was actually the deal that South Africa made on just transition. I was not expecting it, frankly. It was good news. It does tell you that just transition has arrived. People now understand the requirement, if not fully, but at least in part, what it would take to phase out fossil fuels in developing countries. Now, South Africa is a coal-dependent economy. And if you look at similar countries, India, of course, with 70-odd% of India's electricity dependent on coal, and about 50% of primary energy dependent on coal, is a big coal-dependent economy. You have Indonesia, which has also made a conditional pledge to phase out coal. I was pleasantly surprised to hear about Vietnam, which had a fastest growing coal economy right now in Southeast Asia. So there is a healthy discussion happening on just transition. My only concern is that this discussion is not looking at the wide array of issues that a just transition will entail. For example, the focus is on workers largely, and that comes from the experience of the global north, which has a formal economy. Whereas if you are looking at global south, then you are dealing with 90% informal economy. That is also the case with coal economy. In fact, in India, while about 700,000 people work formally in coal industry, you have 4 times more who are informal workers. So you're talking about anywhere between 3 to 5 million people who are involved in coal industry for income. Now, how do you deal with that informal economy, which is poor, which has low capacity, and largely are in parts of countries which are economically depressed? So if you take the coal map of the world and superimpose it with poverty, you will find the same overlap. And it is true across the world. The most economically depressed part of US are coal areas. Same as in South Africa, same as in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, anywhere, okay? So one that you are going to look at regions which have not benefited out of fossil fuel. You are going to look at regions which are informal. You are going to look at regions which are poor. So how do you do just transition in that region? I think just transition is not about either moving workers or community from coal. Just transition has to be viewed as a redevelopment agenda. And that's where I think the discussion is not happening. And we have just published a report where we have looked at what kind of or what components will be there when we are looking at just transition, and we have called it as 5 Rs. The first R is restructuring of economy and industry. You cannot do transition without restructuring the economy and getting new industries, green industries in fossil fuel areas. Because most of these areas are also mono industries. They're relying just on one fossil fuel, whether it is oil or gas or coal. So mono industries, and therefore restructuring of industry is going to become very important. The second R is going to be reskilling and skilling of workforce, and the kind of support system that will be required for existing workers. That's the second R. Third R is going to be revenue substitution. Most of these governments in these areas depend on fossil fuel revenue for running basically the public services. So the third R is revenue substitution. The fourth R is about how do you get responsible social and environmental investment in these areas. these areas have had really bad kind of investment in the past. And we will have to bring in social and environmental responsibility in the investment framework. For example, the other map is that if you take the fossil fuel map and the poverty map and the indigenous community map, it also overlaps. Okay, so in India, for example, most of the coal areas are dominated by scheduled tribes, the indigenous people of India. And that's the same across the world. At least you will have a majority of overlap that will take place. And if you map forest as well, or water resources, you will find pretty much the same overlap. So a responsible social and environmental investment is going to be extremely important. And the point that you mentioned, that is fifth R, how do we repurpose existing infrastructure and land, which are there with coal companies and oil companies and thermal power plants. In India, for example, about 500,000 hectares of land is with coal mines, coal companies. How do we, first of all, rehabilitate and detoxify those areas? How do we use that land? What do we do with that land in terms of economic activity? So restructuring of economy and repurposing of existing infrastructure will go hand in hand, but this is the fifth R. So these 5 Rs are actually development agenda. You are basically trying to redevelop an area. So the scope of just transition has to be widened than what is being discussed right now. Okay, it is just not about taking few 100,000 workers and and giving them some other job or a pension scheme. And therefore, if the scope is development, then the amount of resources required in various forms is going to be very high. Just look at what Germany has done in terms of closing its lignite and thermal power plant. It has a budget price tag of $45 billion. Okay, $45 billion to close down about 40 gigawatts of coal-based power plant and about 200 million tons of lignite production. Now just transpose it to India. We produce, about 150 million tons of lignite production. We produce 5 times more coal. Okay, and our thermal power plant is about 7 times German size. Okay, 6 times. And the number of people who are deployed in coal industry in Germany, I think is about less than 50,000. As I said, we are talking about 4.5 million, 5 million people. So what kind of cost will be required? Now that's the kind of discussion we need to do. Can India afford on its own to put that kind of money? Of course, a large majority of money will come from domestic resources. I'm also clear. I worked in Montreal Protocol. I know what international funding means. If you look at the entire Montreal Protocol funding scheme, I'm diverging, but it is important to make that point. 90% of the money in transition of gases have come from the domestic sources. Okay, domestic industries have invested. 10% money has come through global investment and global transfer of fund under the Montreal Protocol. So while a large majority of money will come from domestic resources to do these redevelopment for just transition, we will need a global framework. South Africa's $8.5 billion deal that has been signed is a good beginning. I'm not aware about the details of that deal, but it will be interesting to see what all it includes and what is the time frame for that transition that we are talking about. So broadly, this is what the challenge is. Just transition is equal to development. I think that's what the framing has to be. Just transition is not equal to shifting a group of labor from coal industry or oil industry or gas industry to something else. That's a very, very limited framing of the issue. And if you really want to have equity and justice, then just transition is equal to development. That's how I think the framing has to be. The discussion has started. I'm very hopeful that more research and more information and more interest will come in this area. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, CB. I think we are certainly touching each other's recommendations also. Global framework is needed. Rebecca, fossil fuel treaty, how it should look like. Can it be a global framework? could be next step?
Just Sanjay, just
yeah,
sorry to
go ahead.
interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Tomorrow at 11:30, we are going to present a global framework meeting.
Excellent.
IFOREST is doing, India Just Transition Center is publishing its report on global framework on just transition.
Perfect.
Tomorrow, 11:30 GMT.
Okay. I think let's have those ideas also in place, because when we are asking questions and we are basically making suggestions in favor of equity and how equity and justice should look like in any kind of transition, I think then it is also on us to provide alternatives as a solutions. I agree with you, CB, that energy transition will be difficult in developing countries compared to developed countries. And primarily because what I hear from you, one, its scale is bigger. And then another thing is we are more informal than formal, what I picked up from you also. And also in developed countries, the social security is more formalized compared to developing countries where it is not, and almost negligible. In many places, nobody knows what does social security means. 5 R's, CB, thank you. Nithi, Southeast Asia, how do you see 5 R's and equity and justice unfolding in Southeast Asia?
Well, thanks, Sanjay. I see them unfolding with great difficulty and great challenges, which civil society has to respond to. Let's look at Southeast Asia as a region. 10 countries which come under the Intergovernmental Association of Southeast Asian Nations, from Myanmar in the west to Philippines in the east, from Vietnam in the north to Indonesia in the south, and the countries in between. We have 1 developed country, 2 least developing countries, and 7 countries which fall in between. It's also one of the most rapidly growing economic regions in the world, and this growth has also led to a huge demand for electricity. The increase in electricity has been, the demand for electricity has been phenomenal, and the response to this demand has been met by almost entirely fossil fuels. And within the fossil fuels component, coal has been getting significantly bigger as the source of the energy mix for electricity. Now, when we look at the projections for the future up to 2040, according to the International Energy Agency, fossil fuels are still going to play a very dominant role, at least about 70%, in contributing to the electricity, in the mix, which generates electricity. So, and within that mix, coal again plays a component role. So, you might see that in a situation where fossil fuels and investment in fossil fuels and electricity plants are going to be fossil fuel dependent, where is the room for discussion on just transition? And the answer is very low, simply because just transition awareness amongst the government is literally non-existent. So we are starting from ground zero. And the other thing is also that apart from Indonesia, which is a major coal mining exporter, nearly all of the other countries are dependent on importing coal. So we are looking at coal in particular. Nearly every other country apart from Indonesia needs to import coal for their electricity generation. So there's zero awareness. And there seems to be no bandwidth to talk about just transition, yet maybe there's one dynamic which has changed, which can lead us to force the issue. This sudden fashion, the sudden trend to declare net zero emissions. So we've got Malaysia, we've got Indonesia, we've got Vietnam, we've got Thailand, all coming up with net zero emissions. So that actually provides a window for us as civil society to start raising awareness on just transition. And Climate Action Network Southeast Asia has already been pushing the agenda on just transition for at least 2 years now. The first time is when we got this unprecedented invitation from the ASEAN Working Group on Climate Change, which is the intergovernmental panel with representatives of the leading climate negotiators in every country in Southeast Asia. When they had their meeting when they scheduled their meeting in 2020, they invited CANSEA to come and attend the meeting as well as present a statement to them. And and CANSEA led the development of the statement in consultation with civil society constituencies. And of the 5 demands we made, one was to have a just energy transition. So we already promoted it then, and this was presented to the negotiators live in late 2020. The second opportunity is, again, when we said, if you are not going to discuss just transition, you're not going to talk about it, we are going to bring the agenda to your table. So then the German foundation, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, together with CANSEA, organized the inaugural Just Transition Forum in Asia in September, on September 9, just a couple of months ago. And it was had a very good positive response. We had about 170 participants discussing issues relating to just transition. And the end conclusion, by popular demand, at the end of it, the conclusion was that we need to institutionalize this dialogue, and it will be an annual event now from going forward from 2022. So that was the second major step. So you're not going to discuss just transition. We're going to continue to discuss it. Civil society is going to raise it to the agenda. And here I must also say that, as you all have already discussed, civil society has a role to play in raising the voices of the most marginalized communities. We are very fortunate and privileged that we can function in the whole spectrum of society. We are there with the marginalized communities on the front lines, on the ground. At the same time, we are also at the level of the decision makers and policy makers where we engage with them with policy. So we can very rapidly translate the voices from the ground to the policy makers whom we engage with. And the third component is, of course, the forthcoming ICI, International Climate Initiative, Just Energy Transition, Innovation Regions for a Just Energy Transition project, which is going to be held in Indonesia. We've come out of the scoping study, which was held for 6 months from March to September this year. And now we are all set to go to really implement it on the ground from early next year. There are 2 things which I like to highlight here. One is when we get onto the ground in Indonesia, we are actually moving into 2 active coal mining regions in East Kalimantan and South Sumatra. So that makes a big difference. And we also have the opportunity to expand the current model, as Chandra Bhushan was saying just now, the Western model, the tripartite, which is basically the employer, worker, government. Here, with civil society, with CANSEA being involved, it's actually going and engaging with the communities, the marginalized communities, the people, because at the end of the day, the tripartite model covers, if you talk about people affected by a coal mining region in just transition, that's a small component. It's the other stakeholders who are far bigger in number. So it gives a wonderful opportunity to go and talk to the communities, engage, involve them, engage with them and consult with them to come up with their vision for alternative livelihoods in the future, which are just, which are clean, which are green, which are sustainable, which have justice at the core of it. So it will be a tremendous learning opportunity, something in which we can create a wealth of information which we can then share with the rest of the world as to how just transition can take place. My final point is that now that, I just want to just raise a final issue, is that now with the multilateral development banks also coming in and facilitating something called what they call a renewable energy transition, there are tens of millions of their investments actually going into the coal mines. And I think this is something, and not where the people are. And there's just been criticism from civil society organizations about a project in Asia, where one particular multilateral development bank is involved. And I think we have to monitor this very carefully, because traditionally the coal mines have already benefited from tens of millions of dollars of subsidies and support. And they are the last ones who actually need the resources when we talk about a just transition program.
Thank you, Nithi. That's perfect. I think what we can see is there is a momentum in South Asia, in Southeast Asia. We heard globally. We also heard from CB. Also, Rebecca, how fossil fuels are on their way out, and why it is important that they should be out soon, and that there should not be a vacuum, a system, a transformed system that need to come, which ensures that communities are not left behind. Before I give floor to our last speaker, I just want to remind that today is the Loss and Damage Day. We are running a campaign, Pay for Loss and Damage Now. You can see printed on my mask.
And maroon.
And maroon color. Thanks, Nithi. We both are wearing maroon color. Great. I think, Nithi, I would again come back. I think we are left with time later on. If you can share your experience about Shift C that you worked on.
Sure.
But before that, Marianne.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Sanjay. And it was good to hear from the other speakers. I think there's a lot of agreement that for the just transition to happen, it actually means to address the Sustainable Development Agenda and to focus on the just energy transition, so ensuring that there is social justice in this. And we see here countries announcing pledges. Countries have the last 2 years, I think, been working on their domestic policies to raise mitigation ambition. And we still see that there's a huge gap between those pledges, what is being implemented, and the policies and the plans. And that gap needs to be reduced through accelerated implementation. And one of the ways to accelerate that implementation is by having very clear just energy transition frameworks and to make those public so that investors, but also energy producers, know how to engage, know what is coming, because this change is coming, and energy producers also need to be able to adapt their business to that change so that they can bring their workforce on board. And as well for investors to also feel secure enough that government is actually going to implement those policies, those plans, and those targets, so that they can start investing in the future and in renewable energy. I think the example that has been mentioned on South Africa, I think, is a very good one in a global perspective. No, I mean, South Africa comes forward and announces a very ambitious plan of coal phase out, and then the US, the UK, and the EU respond to that with investment. But as Chandra Bhushan also said, that investment is 8.5 billion at the moment, and it's definitely not enough. It's not what has been used in developed countries to actually achieve the energy transition. I'm from Denmark myself. I mean, the Danish energy sector has definitely gone through a transition, and that was more expensive. So there is also a need to ramp up the numbers and the finance. And then there is this piece of when we are in the transition. I mean, it is a process that will take time. So even though we have a sense of urgency and we need to act fast to reach the 1.5, we also need to be aware of that the process as such will take time, in particular when wanting to ensure that civil society and communities also have a seat at the table and have a say in terms of, what does the redirection of our societies, what does that look like? What do we want to see on the land that need to be restored? What kind of socioeconomic alternatives or economic alternatives do we envision for the communities that live in the affected areas? And you cannot just have like one or two round tables where you invite civil society representatives and they give their opinion. You actually need to have a process to bring in people so that the investments then also get channeled into the right solutions and the solutions that are supported by communities and by civil society. So I think important points from my side. And I'll hand it back to you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Marianne. That's great. I just want to check if we have any online questions. If not, we can go one round, and I will urge if all the online participants, if you'd like to raise your hand and pose a question also, there's a box where you need to type your question. We as a panelist will be happy to take it. And let's give 5-10 minutes, hoping that more questions will come. We certainly want to make it more interactive with all of you. I know we are all in a more digital world, sitting in a studio. Earlier, the side event used to be more a panel interacting directly with participants. But I think digital world has certainly a lot of advantage of its own, so let's use them. CB, we heard about how net zero announcements are there. We also heard about there's a momentum towards energy transition. Marianne mentioned about how energy transition could add to ambition. Do you think there is a linkage between net zero announcements sending right signals to energy transition? How it's going to unfold?
So I think there is a merit, and I'll say symbolic merit of net zero announcement, because India's announcement, for example, of 2070 is 50 years ahead. Yeah. US is 30 years ahead in time. None of the leaders who have announced it are going to be there. But there is a symbolic importance of these announcements simply because we are setting a long-term target of what we want to achieve. Yeah. Now, for net zero essentially to become, these targets to get operationalized, there are a few basic components that are required. One is that it must be embedded with NDCs in a way that you are going to revise your NDC every 5 year or 10 year, keeping in view that net zero target. So there has to be extremely important linkage between net zero target and NDC, yeah. and you will be measured on that. Yeah. And that holds true for US, for India, for any other country. Yeah. The second is these net zero targets have to be embedded in domestic law. Without having a legal framework, these announcements are just an announcement. And therefore, climate change laws, domestic climate change law, becomes extremely important to hold governments accountable. The third aspect of net zero, which is extremely important, is that you will have to also embed it with your energy transition and just transition pathways. If you are not mapping your just transition pathway with your net zero pathway, then there is a mismatch. Yeah. Simply because there could be a condition where your society is not ready to move, and you are pushing that agenda up and creating a lot of disruption in the society. So once you have announced your net zero target, you must map how you are going to move it, both technology-wise, economic-wise, and social-wise. And the last part of this entire net zero agenda has to be that it is based on differentiation. But I think we have taken this differentiation to a different extent this time. It doesn't make any sense for developed countries to say they are going to become net zero by 2050. And therefore, India can justifiably say that I am going to become net zero by 2070. Yeah. Okay. Someone in Africa can say, I am going to become net zero by 2080. Okay. So it's a race to the bottom that we are seeing right now. And therefore, realistically speaking, if you are looking at global net zero, of CO2 by 2050, then developed countries will have to go somewhere by 2040. China will have to go soon after that. And India and other countries will have to go soon after 2050. Then you are looking at this as a realistic goal of hitting 1.5C target. So these are some of the issues that needs to be discussed. I think the most important is how do we get net zero, an energy transition target enshrined in domestic law. Otherwise, it is meaningless. And therefore, this entire movement of getting domestic climate law is something that we all will have to work in our country and work on this issue.
Thank you, CB. I think a roadmap, how you're going to achieve your net zero, what needs to be done immediately. And I think the fact that net zero commitments are all these pledges that they are coming so late, and ideally they should have come 20 years back, but they're coming so late that we have to start implementing them now. And this roadmap is embedded into a domestic law, would certainly make it a very robust system and it will give guarantee also that we will head towards it. And this will certainly send signals to corporate sector, Rebecca, that I will not say their days are over, but I would say the existing business practices is going to be outdated. What FFNPT team is working on, interacting with corporates, I think we should not hate them. We should certainly help them to transform. That's my personal view, Rebecca.
Thanks. I mean, it's a great question. I think there's this challenge around how we interact with the fossil fuel industry. I mean, ultimately, under a 1.5 degree target, there isn't space for continued production of fossil fuels. And so the fossil fuel industry needs to, as you say, change its business model. If it wants to continue to exist, fossil fuel companies need to become energy companies, or they need to diversify and move into new sectors. And I think the challenge is that there are a lot of, I think it's actually very linked to the net zero discussion. There are a lot of commitments and a lot of statements that are being made by fossil fuel companies that suggest that they recognize that they need to be net zero by 2050, for example, but doing it in such a way where it's a complete greenwash. It's easy to say that you expect to be net zero by 2050 if you're relying on unrealistic amounts of carbon capture and storage when that technology still isn't proven and doesn't really exist at scale yet. And so, yes, it's important that we recognize the role that fossil fuel corporations play in that if they decide that they will transition it actually in line with what the science requires and actually phase out fossil fuels and scale up renewable energy, that can be a huge positive, and they can kind of, in many ways, leave behind some of the terrible decisions that have been made in the past about continued production when clearly we knew climate change was happening. But I think it's really important that fossil fuel companies just recognize that there isn't a continued place in the world for them if they don't start to undertake that transition. So, I mean, our campaign is very much focused on governments and on what governments should be doing in terms of regulating and recognising the need for transition and also on international support for developing communities. But within that, there's a role for governments to also be regulating the fossil fuel sector and ensuring that it isn't continuing to produce long, beyond what's actually possible and is starting to scale down immediately and recognise that need for transition.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think certainly corporates, we need to work with them to make sure that they become part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. Nithi, I know Southeast Asia, can Southeast Asia work extensively on shifting finances from fossil fuel? Can you share some examples, and especially the challenges you face in terms of questions being asked, or how did the corporate sector reacted to the work that you did?
Yeah, certainly, Sanjay. So a lot of this work was also based on the shifting financial flows to invest in low-carbon development project, which was supported by the German agency ICI between 2018 and 2019. And so this was also related to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. And so in our work, it was a multi-consortium project with a focus on Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And we were actually engaging with the financial sector in talking to them on basically to stop financing fossil fuels. And it was interesting because when we talked to bankers and of course the multilateral development banks, when we talked to the commercial bankers in particular, they were always, we are ready to shift our financial flows if you give us the alternative projects. We are ready to finance renewable energy projects. Bring them to us. So what we did was, as part of the project, was to enable this, we created multi-stakeholder alliances within the countries where we were working, whereby they could facilitate this kind of alternative financing scenarios and new products for the banks to offer. In the Philippines, it was rooftop solar, the same in Vietnam, where the government actually backs that. Of course, much smaller scale than, huge oil and gas investments. So in Indonesia, we created the Indonesia Low Emissions Network with more than 100 organizations, which 70% of them coming from the private sector. And the whole idea was for them to mobilize, these are some of them very major companies, for them to mobilize the kind of projects which could be, the alternative projects in the energy sector, the renewable energy projects, which would then motivate the financial institutions to shift the money away from what they were using to finance fossil fuel projects and put it into renewable energy. The same happened in Vietnam as well with the creation of the Vietnam Coalition for Climate Action, and in the Philippines, the Climate Action Partnership. So these were some of the steps we did to facilitate this shift, and the networks continue to do so.
Perfect. Thank you, Nithi. Do we have any more questions online? No? Okay. Then I think we can certainly wind up. I will give floor to all participants to say a few words before I close it. Marianne.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. I was just reminded also by the net zero discussion we have, and reminded by, we are at the COP in Glasgow, and there are negotiations happening on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the Glasgow breakthroughs and announcements of net zero, and a lot of these outside or supplementary commitments. And then we have this whole question of how do we achieve a transition, and how do we signal to investors and the public and the energy producers that actually governments are now going to take that step and phase out fossil fuels. And for that, I think governments need to be clear, not only in the supplementary commitments and in the action agenda, but also in the negotiations to make that political statement. And as part of the COP outcomes, it needs to be very clear that governments are going to phase out fossil fuels, so that they send a very clear signal to the public, this is coming, and we need to start to prepare for this shift. And also to investors, etc. So, this whole, so the announcements actually have to be part of the political movement, and so that they eventually can also become part of national law, part of national policies, and part of the thinking of, the public knowing. I think some of the people at home are waiting for this to happen, right? And others are concerned. So, but both of them need clarity. And, providing that clarity is really a very important outcome that we're hoping for here from Glasgow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rebecca?
I can.
Last 2 cents.
Absolutely, yeah, no, I completely agree. I think with what Marianne just said about bringing these exciting pledges that are happening outside the space into the space, and also I think with what Chandra was saying earlier about these exciting pledges, bringing them into the negotiations and bringing them into domestic law and policy so that they actually mean something.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a growing momentum and a growing recognition that fossil fuels is a part of the conversation through these big pledges, but whether or not that plays out in reality is unclear yet. And I also, agree with the point that has been made by many of the panelists. This isn't just a question of phasing out fossil fuels and transitioning to renewables. It's really a development question, and it requires a huge amount of investment, both from countries themselves, but particularly from the international community. And so I really hope that that point starts to become more recognized as well going forward.
Perfect. Thanks. Nithi?
Yeah, I would talk about, I would take a point which Marianne made earlier, where the community and the people need a place on the table. And this is one of the things I hope we can see with the Just Energy Transition project in Indonesia, whereby during the process, an institutionalized framework is created whereby the community is, a standing committee, a permanent committee is created, maybe facilitated by the local authority or the regional authority, whereby the community is at the table and is part of an ongoing discussion towards creating their own vision for the future. And the other thing I would also like to emphasize the need for the institutionalization, the policy coherence, institutionalization of just transition policies and a roadmap, because otherwise, without these things taking place, it'll remain mere talk.
Yeah. CB?
So I want to bring the issue of, is there a need to prioritize fossil fuels? I see that discussion happening a lot, that we need to get coal out first, and then we will look at gas and oil, and therefore there is this discussion about that we are going to make coal history, and then we will look at other fossil fuels. Considering the timeline of what we are looking at in terms of 1.5C, I think this is a self-defeating discussion that is happening right now, that we will first only focus on coal and then we will look at gas and oil. I think the fossil fuel in entirety has to be looked at. Some countries are dependent on coal. They will have to phase out coal. Some are dependent on gas. They will have to phase out gas. Some are dependent on oil. They will have to phase out oil. Yeah. So one that, as a civil society, I believe that there has to be a strong voice, that no prioritization of one fossil fuel over another as far as climate change is concerned. Okay. The second point that I would like to make is that I'm not calling it as just energy transition, because it's not only energy transition, it is also industrial transition. Yeah. Your heavy industries are largely dependent on fossil fuels, from steel to cement to fertilizer. All of them are. And they too will have to transition, whether they move to hydrogen or they move to renewable energy, whatever they want to do. But so, again, by just putting it as energy transition, we are limiting the scope of what kind of transition that is required. So these are the 2 points I wanted to make. And I think I'm very happy, frankly speaking, in terms of the way the just transition debate is happening at COP26. Going ahead, I think it will be much more substantial, which is good for everyone. And bringing community on table is extremely important. It cannot be a tripartite between industry, labor, and government to decide the scope of just transition.
Thank you, CB. I totally agree with you. I think it's certainly, in fact, what we are discussing, I could see a definition emerging out in terms of what energy transition should envisage. We cannot leave anyone behind for sure. But one thing is very clear, investing more into fossil fuel is not a good idea. It's not a good financial idea. For investors, because you are going to lock in your money and you may not be able to recover money because it will the renewables will catch up very fast. In my opinion, it's also one line start thinning of fossil fuel, the renewable energy line start expanding. So certainly it's not one after another. One will start leaving space for other, and others will take on, because we cannot stop thermal power plants today. We have to give them time to make sure that renewable energy comes over. And that's what normally governments hear. So we are not saying that, we are saying, but set it into a timeline, do not delay it. further, do it as soon as possible if that requires difficult decisions to be taken. Certainly, we need to frame architecture for energy transition that should ensure justice for communities, that should be equitable. And in fact, there have been a lot of problems in the existing energy system. We have not been able to electrify so many villages in developing countries. I hope energy transition or incoming solar and renewable will open. They do open, options for decentralized systems, and that would mean energy can reach to millions. Certainly, objective should be sustainable, affordable, predictable energy, which includes security for future generation. So with that, I'll close today's discussion. Thank you, guys. It has been great interacting with you.
Thank you.